welcome to this deep dive
Deep dive.
into the grammar translation method.
I like it.
Yeah. So, you're interested in understanding this approach to language learning.
Okay.
And trust me, going back in time to explore this traditional method, it's been quite a journey for me.
It's fascinating to see how this method, often perceived as outdated, actually shaped language education for centuries.
It really is like peeking into a language learning time capsule.
Yeah.
So let's unpack this method.
Right?
Our sources define the grammar translation method,
Okay.
sometimes called the traditional or classical method,
Right.
as a method centered around,
Okay.
you guessed it, grammar and translation.
Yeah.
It involves a lot of back and forth translation
Right.
between your native language and the language you're trying to learn.
Okay.
Picture a classroom where you're constantly switching between, say, English and Spanish,
Uh-huh.
dissecting sentences,
Yeah.
and obsessing over grammar rules. Doesn't that sound a bit different from the language learning apps you might be used to?
It does indeed. And this approach has its roots in the 19th century German school of education. Back then, formal communication was primarily written. Think letters, official documents, scholarly articles. This method reflects that emphasis on the written word.
So it makes sense that speaking and listening skills
Yeah,
weren't the main focus back then.
right.
Now, one of the sources mentions that this method is grounded in a concept called constructivism.
Yes,
Could you demystify that for us?
absolutely. Constructivism, in simple terms, suggests that we learn by actively building our knowledge through experiences and interactions. Imagine learning to ride a bike. You don't just read a manual and magically know how to do it right. You learn by trying, falling, and adjusting. Similarly, with this method, the idea is that you learn a language by actively engaging with its grammar and vocabulary and by applying those rules through translation.
So it's not about passively absorbing words and phrases.
Right.
It's about actively constructing your understanding of the language.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm.
Now let's get into the nitty-gritty
Okay.
of the grammar translation method.
All right.
Our sources outline a few key principles
Right.
that make this method unique.
Mm-hmm.
One that jumps out is limited use of the target language.
Right.
This means that most of the learning happens in your native language.
Mm-hmm.
It seems counterintuitive to learn a language without actually speaking it much, doesn't it?
Yeah.
What's the logic behind that?
The idea was that using the student's native language would ensure clarity and make it easier for them to grasp the grammar rules. It was like building a bridge between the familiar and the unfamiliar.
Okay, so easing them in step by step.
Right.
Another principle that caught my eye
Okay.
is deductive grammar learning.
Mm-hmm.
This means you learn the grammar rules first, and then you get to apply those rules through examples and exercises.
Yeah.
It's a very structured approach, almost like learning math.
Yeah, I was going to say that.
You learn the formula before you try to solve the problem.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
It's about understanding the underlying structure of the language before you start using it.
Now, this next principle seems pretty self-explanatory.
Okay.
Focus on reading and writing.
Yeah.
Basically, reading comprehension and written exercises are king,
Right.
while speaking and listening take a back seat.
Mm-hmm.
It really highlights how different the priorities were back then
Mm-hmm.
compared to today's emphasis on communication.
Exactly. The goal was to equip students to read and translate scholarly texts, not necessarily to chat with native speakers.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about vocabulary acquisition through translation.
Mm-hmm.
This seems like a core element of the method.
Okay.
You're basically learning new words by translating them back and forth between the two languages,
Right.
often using word lists.
Uh-huh.
How effective is this approach for actually using the language in real-life situations?
Well, translation can be helpful for understanding the meaning of words in isolation. It doesn't always prepare you for the nuances and flow of natural conversation.
You're right, context is key when it comes to language.
Yeah.
And speaking of context, the sources emphasize memorization, and a crucial part of this method.
Okay.
Rote learning of grammar rules,
Yeah.
vocabulary lists, and translations seems to be a major part of the learning process.
Yeah.
It's almost like a mental workout.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on rote learning,
Mm-hmm.
and how does it fit into this method's goals?
It's interesting because rote learning can be effective for memorizing facts and rules, but it might not be the most engaging way to achieve fluency.
It's like memorizing the ingredients without learning how to cook a delicious meal.
Uh-huh.
And that brings us to another key principle,
Okay.
the teacher-centered approach.
Mm.
It seems like the teacher is very much in control directing the learning process every step of the way.
Yeah.
Imagine a classroom with rows of desks, students diligently taking notes,
Right.
and the teacher at the front leading the lesson with absolute authority.
It was a very traditional hierarchical model of education. Knowledge flowed from the teacher to the students, and the student's primary role was to absorb that knowledge.
A very top-down approach.
Yeah.
Another principle highlighted in the sources
Yeah.
is the focus on accuracy.
Right.
It seems that getting those translations and grammar structures absolutely perfect,
Uh-huh.
even if it means speaking a little slower,
Mm-hmm.
is a major goal.
It's about prioritizing precision and correctness over fluency and spontaneity.
So it's more about getting the building blocks right than sounding natural right away.
Exactly.
And then, of course, we have the use of translation techniques,
Yeah.
which is really the heart and soul of this method.
Right.
We've already touched upon it.
Yeah.
But it's worth emphasizing that translation is the primary tool for learning and reinforcing.
Mm-hmm.
It's all about bridging that gap between the two languages through constant translation exercises.
It's the glue that holds all the other principles together.
Now, this next principle might come as a bit of a surprise.
Right.
One of our sources mentions active participation of students.
Oh, interesting.
So even though it's a teacher-centered approach, students are still expected to actively engage in those translation and grammar drills.
Great.
It's not just about passively listening to the teacher.
They're actively applying the knowledge and practicing the skills they've been taught.
So it's a very hands-on approach,
Ah.
even if it's all about grammar and translation.
Yeah.
And speaking of hands-on, let's move on to some of the specific techniques that were used in the classroom to bring this method to life.
Okay.
I have to say, some of these are pretty intriguing, and it might even seem familiar.
Right.
What are some of the techniques that stand out to you?
Well, there's the obvious one, translation, which we've already discussed. But there are other techniques like fill in the blanks, cognates, and even composition. These techniques were all designed to reinforce the learning of grammar and vocabulary.
Right. And they offer a fascinating glimpse into how language learning was approached back in the day. We'll dive into these techniques in more detail in the next part of our deep dive. But before we move on, is there anything else about these key principles that you find particularly interesting or surprising?
I think it's remarkable how this method, while seemingly rigid, also emphasizes active engagement from the students. They're not just passively absorbing information, they're actively applying their knowledge through these exercises.
That's a great point. It challenges the assumption that traditional methods were all about rote learning and passive listening. There's definitely more to it than meets the eye. And that's what makes exploring these different approaches so fascinating. It's like peeling back the layers of history and understanding how our views on language learning have evolved over time.
And it makes you wonder how these seemingly outdated approaches might still hold relevance in today's world.
You're right. We might be surprised at what we can learn from the past. But more on that later. For now, let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll delve into those intriguing classroom techniques and explore what it was actually like to learn a language using this method. Stay tuned.
Sounds good. Welcome back. I'm eager to delve into these techniques and shed light on what a classroom using this method would look like in action.
Me too. It's like we're about to step into a historical reenactment of language learning.
Yeah.
So we've already touched on some of the techniques, but I'm curious to explore them in more detail.
Okay.
Let's start with the classic translation technique.
Right.
One of the sources gives an example of translating a passage about a relevant topic,
Okay.
like, say, the COVID-19 pandemic,
Right.
from one language to another.
Yeah.
It sounds like a pretty hands-on way to grapple with the intricacies of the language.
Absolutely. Translation forces you to break down sentences, analyze their structure, and carefully consider the meaning of each word in relation to the others. It's a deep dive into the mechanics of the language.
And that's where those grammar drills and vocabulary lists come in handy, right?
Exactly. It's like having a toolbox filled with the right tools for the job.
Speaking of tools,
Mm-hmm.
the source has also mentioned fill in the blanks as a common technique.
Okay.
This one seems pretty straightforward.
Mhm.
You've got a sentence with a missing word, and you have to choose the correct option based on your understanding of grammar and vocabulary.
Yeah.
It's like a mini quiz to test your knowledge.
It's a simple but effective way to reinforce what you've learned and to make sure those grammar rules are sinking in.
Now, this next technique is one that really piqued my interest.
Okay.
Cognates.
Uh-huh.
Cognates are words in different languages that look and sound similar
Right.
because they share a common root.
Yeah.
It's like finding those linguistic gems that make learning new vocabulary a little less daunting.
I like that.
Yeah.
Linguistic gems.
For
Yeah.
example, the English word operation and its Arabic counterpart are almost identical.
Oh.
Have you come across any surprising or amusing cognate pairs in your language learning experiences?
Oh, absolutely. Cognates are like little linguistic Easter eggs. It's always a delight to discover them. I remember being amused by the fact that the German word for hand is hand, spelled exactly the same way in English. It makes you realize how interconnected languages can be.
It's like those aha moments that make language learning so rewarding.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on to reading comprehension questions.
Okay.
How does this technique work within the framework of the grammar translation method?
It involves presenting students with a passage to read,
Okay.
maybe a historical account, a literary excerpt, or even a scientific article,
Right.
and then asking them questions to assess their understanding of the text.
Hmm.
It's not just about translating word for word, it's about extracting meaning from the text as a whole.
So it's like a test of how well you can apply your grammar and vocabulary knowledge to understand a piece of writing.
Exactly. It's about moving beyond the individual components of language and using them to engage with a complete thought.
And then there's the technique of exploring synonyms and antonyms.
Right.
It seems like a classic way to expand vocabulary and delve into the finer shades of meaning.
It is synonyms and antonyms encourage you to think about the relationships between words, how different words can convey similar or opposite meanings, and how those subtle differences can impact the overall message. It's a great way to build a richer and more nuanced vocabulary.
It's like becoming a word connoisseur, appreciating the subtle flavors of language.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay, so we've covered translation, fill-in-the-blanks cognates, reading comprehension questions, and synonyms and antonyms. Of course, let's not forget memorization,
Right.
which seems to be woven into the very fabric of this method.
Yeah.
Rote learning is definitely a key element here.
Repetition and memorization were considered crucial for solidifying knowledge and ensuring that grammar rules and vocabulary were firmly implanted in the students' minds.
Now, taking a step back to look at the bigger picture,
Okay.
what were the ultimate goals of the grammar translation method? What kind of language learner was it designed to produce?
Well, if we consider the historical context, the primary goal was to equip students with the ability to read and translate classical texts. Think Greek philosophy, Latin literature, and historical documents. It was about preserving and transmitting knowledge from the past.
So fluency and conversational skills weren't really top priorities.
Not in the way we think of them today.
Hmm.
The emphasis was on accuracy, comprehension, and the ability to unlock the meaning of those ancient texts.
It's amazing how the goals of language learning have shifted over time, reflecting changes in society, technology, and our global interconnectedness. Nowadays, we tend to prioritize real-world communication and the ability to connect with people from different cultures.
Precisely. The digital age has revolutionized how we interact and communicate, and language learning has adapted to reflect these changes.
So while the grammar translation method may not be the most practical approach for achieving fluency in today's world, it's a valuable reminder of how language learning has evolved. It laid the foundation for a more structured and analytical approach to language, and some of its elements like understanding grammar and leveraging cognates can still be useful today.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that different methods have their strengths and weaknesses, and what's considered outdated might still hold valuable insights for modern language learners.
I agree. It's all about finding the right tools and techniques to fit your individual learning style and goals. What stands out to you as the most intriguing aspect of this method? What has resonated with you the most as we've explored its nuances?
For me, it's the stark contrast between this very structured, teacher-centric approach and the more communicative, learner-centered methods that are popular today. It's like comparing a vintage typewriter to a sleek smartphone. They both serve the purpose of communication, but they represent vastly different eras and approaches.
That's a fantastic analogy.
Yes.
It highlights the incredible evolution of language learning and how our understanding of the process has changed over time. And I think that's one of the key takeaways from this deep dive. There's no single right way to learn a language. It's about finding what works best for you, exploring different approaches, and even drawing inspiration from seemingly outdated methods.
Exactly. And I think this leads us to a crucial question to consider.
Yeah, it really does. It feels like all this talk about grammar rules and translations has actually opened up a whole new way of thinking about language learning for me.
It's all about broadening our perspectives and recognizing that there's always more to learn and discover, even from approaches we might initially dismiss as outdated. So here's a thought-provoking question for you.
Ooh, I love a good brain teaser. Let's hear it.
How might the principles of this method, despite its limitations, still hold relevance for certain aspects of language learning today? Could some of its techniques, even in adapted forms, be useful for specific learning goals or contexts?
That's a fantastic question to ponder. It challenges us to think critically about the grammar translation method's legacy and to consider whether there are any hidden gems that we can still glean from this seemingly antiquated approach.
Perhaps some of its techniques could be helpful for developing specific skills. For instance, if you're learning a language with a complex writing system like Mandarin Chinese or Japanese focusing on grammatical structures and practicing translation could be beneficial for improving reading and writing skills.
That's a great point. It's like using a magnifying glass to examine the intricate details of the language.
Right.
And even for languages with simpler writing systems, understanding the underlying grammar can give you a deeper appreciation for the nuances of the language.
Exactly. It's like having a secret decoder ring that unlocks a deeper level of understanding.
So while the grammar translation method may not be the most efficient way to achieve conversational fluency, it can still offer valuable tools for language learners.
It's a reminder that we can learn from both the past and the present as we continue our language learning journeys.
Well said. This deep dive into the grammar translation method has been incredibly insightful. It's given me a newfound appreciation for the history of language learning and the diverse range of approaches that have shaped how we learn languages today.
It's been a pleasure sharing this exploration with you.
And a huge thank you to you, dear listener, for joining us on this journey back in time. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep those language fires burning.